Why does it matter? Well, again, as Christy said, I studied in my undergraduate studies English and history. And it was really not an intentional thing, but it was really interesting to, as you go through a study of world history and world literature, you notice this really interesting phenomenon that emerges. Okay? So as people begin to talk about themselves as a people and create an identity for themselves, when you look at the greatest empires throughout history, like we could talk about Egypt, Greece, Rome, and so on, it doesn't really matter. But you will notice that the people begin to tell stories about themselves that reflect a belief in their own greatness long before they ever had an empire. And so we can see that if we look in particular at things like their mythology, there's these themes that run through the mythology. They have stories about, cultural heroes and gods and prophecies. And these prophecies are about themselves. And the prophecies say, we are going to be a great empire. And again, this is long before they ever had an empire. And we can see, even when we look at the history of the United States and we read the literature of the United States, we see that exact same pattern emerge. So, what began here as 13 ragtag backwater colonies, they decided that they were going to take on the greatest empire in the world. And in fact, it was one of the greatest empires in the history of the world. If you look at maps of where the English empire spread, it was huge. And they decided, hey, we're going to take on this empire. And why are we going to do that? Well, we can look at our Declaration of Independence. And what does it say? It cites the protection of divine providence. Okay? So basically, our founders of this country from the very beginning, what did they say? They said, hey, guess what? God is on our side, and we have a great destiny. And if God is on your side, how can you possibly lose, right? And so they believed, and they did. They took actions, and they made decisions that actually resulted in what we have today. And we can see, too, this theme of American exceptionalism that we hear, talked about in the news sometimes today. And this is just the idea that somehow the United States is unique and exceptional in world history, that there's never been anything like it before. Okay? And because of that exceptionalism, certain other beliefs developed out of that. But we see these writings that continue in our literature from the founders, philosophers, religious leaders, politicians, journalists, and you can even read it in our history books, right? I have a fun time. I have a weird thing. I like to read old history books and see how we talked about ourselves long ago, because it was different than the way we talk about ourselves now. Out of these beliefs of American exceptionalism, we also developed this belief called manifest destiny. Okay, you probably heard of that. What does it mean? Well, our artists and our musicians and our poets, they began writing about how because we are exceptional as a nation and because we have the divine favor of God, we have every right, and in fact we are preordained to spread from sea to shining sea. And never mind that there's already people here, right? God gave it to us, it's ours, and we're going to take it. And so they assume this identity based upon the story that we tell. And because of that identity, they begin to make decisions and they begin to take actions that in fact led to spreading from sea to shining sea. And that's what we have today. And it came out of a few words in our Declaration of Independence. The divine protection of God. Okay, this demonstrates for you the incredible power of storytelling. Now, it's fashionable today to criticize our ancestors, but really the truth is they're not unique. This kind of storytelling has been something that people have done for as long as there have been people, right? Whenever people have gathered around campfires throughout history, what do? It's the same thing you do now. You tell stories, right? And so we don't do that like we used to because we don't cook around a campfire, fortunately. But what do we do now? Well, when we gather around the proverbial water cooler, or over your neighbor's fence, or over a cup of coffee, what do? We tell stories, okay? And believe it or not, those stories, they're not just about events. I'm not just telling you so-and-so did such and such and such. That's not what I'm telling you. Because every time that you tell a story, what else are you doing with it? Well, you're communicating the values and the culture and purpose of our people. It's the universal approach we have, storytelling, to understanding who we are. When we look at the world around us, oftentimes all we see is chaos, right? We watch the news and we feel like, what's going on? What's the point of this? Well, how do we make sense of that? We start to tell stories. And journalists, they even call them narratives. Because that's what they're doing. They're taking these events and they're putting them in an order and they're putting a spin on it. They're interpreting it and they're giving you meaning to what is happening around you. So we use stories, we rely on stories to understand the world and our place within it. And our stories, they tell us who we are and how we ought to behave as people. So for example, imagine even when you're just gossiping, right? You have somebody that you know who did something that maybe was kind of foolish, and you're telling a story about them. What are you doing? You're not just telling that story. You're not just telling events. What you're doing is you're giving them meaning. You're filtering it and you're giving it some kind of purpose. And you're telling people that in this same situation, here is what a good member of our society would have done or should have done. Okay? That's what you're doing when you're gossiping. Because you have values that you've assigned to that particular event. And so these ancient stories that we have, they're really just water cooler stories. And they're embellished, and they're told around campfires, and they're used as a way to pass along our culture and our knowledge and our values from one generation to the next. Okay? And again, that is the power of storytelling.